Hey folks, this is Cindy. Thanks so much for stopping by. This is take 2 for the Winnie and Walter May 2018 Leading Lady, and today we're going to be talking about colored pencils on Kraft, or rather colored pencils on colored cardstock. I know a lot of folks get really frustrated with colored pencils, and actually they're a really fun medium to use and they have a lot of versatility, and we'll talk about that more here in just a few minutes. In the meantime, let's take a look at the stamp set that we're going to be using today. This is the Winnie and Walter Evelin T Designs Purrfect stamp set. Anybody else want to purr when they say perfect? Anyway, so this is the Purrfect stamp set, and look at all these darling kitties. I'm a huge fan of cats. If anybody knows me, they know that my cat is my baby. So this stamp set is right up my alley, and it has loads and loads of images. I'm actually only going to use a little teacup there with the two little kitties in it today, but man, you could build up a really fantastic scene with this entire stamp set. It would be a ball. They also have the cutaway dies that coordinate with this, and I'm not going to use the die with this stamp set today, or with the stamp today, but I love that this is an option. I even love that that little cat tree has its own die. I think that is just off the hook. All right, so let's take a look at this card here, and let's start talking about colored pencils on colored cardstock. Now, most folks will go to Nina's Desert Storm cardstock. Some folks will use the Strathmore Toned Tanned cardstock. Both of those work just fine. However, the trick is you just need a good cardstock that has some tooth. If you feel a little bit of texture in some of them, like the Gina K Kraft cardstock that I'm using here, not only does it have a little bit of texture, but it feels soft, and that's perfect. That's exactly what you need in order to make it work a little bit easier for yourself. So I have this card panel cut down to 4¼ inches by 5½ inches, and I'm stamping this in Gina K black ink, and I'm going to leave that stamp there on my Misty. I am using a Misty because I'm going to leave that stamp on there, and I'm going to use it again here after a bit, and we'll talk about that more when we get there. In the meantime, I'm going to start coloring this guy in, and I'm starting with my darkest Prismacolor gray pencil, and I'll have these linked down below in the description as well as over on my blog. I'm not going to run through the colors here because the colors don't really matter. That's kind of not the point. You could use any colors you would like to color in any image you like. You just need a really good colored pencil, and you need a really good cardstock. Fundamentally, that's what it comes down to. So I'm starting with my darkest gray pencil here, and I'm just kind of working in very tight circular motions. It's almost like a scrubbing. I believe there's a term that's called wooling or lamb's wool. It's the same idea. It's that really packed circular motion. That's what you want to do. You don't want to add a lot of pressure. You don't need to, because you're going to go back over this by the time you're all finished. So just a light amount of pressure. Let the natural color of that colored pencil work for you. So it's already a dark gray pencil, and even with a light hand, you're going to see some dark gray shading, and that's fine. You can go back over it later. You don't want to build up too much of that color right away, because it's going to get to the point, even with a great cardstock, you're going to get to the point where you can't add any more color onto it. Then I went with a medium gray pencil, and I went just barely over the edge of that dark gray, and then I went to another lighter gray colored pencil, and now I'm at my lightest gray pencil. And as you can see, I've left myself tons of highlight space. When I go back over this, I'm actually going to start filling some of that in. So now I'm on my second layer, and I'm adding just a little bit more pressure. The nice thing about having a good cardstock to use with your colored pencil is you don't automatically feel like you need to put a lot of pressure, because that cardstock has just enough give to it that it's breaking down those fibers. It's taking on that pigment even with a light hand, and that's great. That's exactly what you're looking for in a cardstock. And it doesn't matter what color you use. You could use a hot pink cardstock with colored pencils, and as long as it has some tooth to it, and as long as it has a little bit of give to it, you're going to get the same results in just different colors. So I'm just going to continue to build up these colors here and get them where I want to. And honestly, folks, take your time with colored pencils. I know sometimes it's really hard to switch from like a Copic or a watercolor where you can get a lot of depth, you can get a lot of color right out of the gate. Colored pencils aren't like that. They're a little bit different animals, so to speak, in terms of that approach. You really have to take your time and build up to it. The other thing that I like about colored pencils is there's lots of different things that you could do with them. I could have colored in these little kitties with my Copics. I could have done just a quick coloring with them and then went in with my colored pencils and added all of the details there. I could colored in with my Copics and then just use colored pencils to add in more depth, more dimension just in my darker areas. I could use a white colored pencil and I could use that just on my highlights. I could go over watercolor with colored pencils. There's so much that you can do with a colored pencil. One of my favorite things that I have seen is you color in with your Copics, and then you're going to finish everything off with your colored pencil. So you're really bringing it to life that way. And I love that. I love the way that it looks. I also think that it's a nice complement to Copic markers, specifically Copic markers, because Copics are wet and colored pencils are dry. There's comes a point with Copics where there's only so much you can do because it is a wet medium, and by nature Copics want to spread out. They want to naturally blend because that's what they do. That's how they're formulated and that's how they work. With colored pencils, you could go back over your Copic work. You could add in those details, and because colored pencils are dry, it doesn't spread out. It doesn't blend. You can make it look blended, but it doesn't blend on its own. And I just think that that's so wonderful. Okay, so at this point, I'm coloring in my little teacup here, and I purposely chose this bright blue-green for this card because I really wanted this teacup to pop off the page. I chose a very clean and simple approach for a couple reasons. Number one, I really wanted this coloring to just simply stand out on its own. I wanted it to be the focal point. And also, colored pencils can be such an intimidating subject anyways. I didn't want to complicate it further by doing any more masking or any other specific technique. I really just wanted to focus this on colored pencils. And then the third thing is, because colored pencils do take a little bit longer to use, I wanted to keep this clean and simple because I didn't want this video to be out of control long and everybody gets bored because I'm talking about colored pencils. So that's why I'm doing that. I started with my darkest colored pencil, my darkest blue-green, and I'm working my way out to my lightest. This is kind of a different approach for me. I spend most of my time Copic coloring, and if you follow me at all, you'll know I always map out with my lightest color, go to my darkest, and then work my way back out to my lightest. With colored pencils, you don't need to do that. You can absolutely save that step. Now, you're still going to be investing the time in building up that color to finish off your image with colored pencils, but it is kind of nice that you can just start right out the gate with your darkest color. If that makes you nervous at all, certainly map it out with your lightest color. Put your darkest over the top of that, just like you would with Copic coloring. The only thing is, what you're going to really notice with a colored pencil is when you put a darker colored pencil over a lighter one, it is going to make that darker one seem lighter. It's going to make it seem brighter. It's going to pop out more. And it is going to change the color of your darkest pencil. You might find that a little bit frustrating, but certainly if you're nervous about going in directly with your darkest color on a colored pencil, you can definitely do it that way. Put your lightest down and then go over with your darkest. So the other thing that you can do with colored pencils that I didn't do in the video, and I didn't do it for simplicity's sake, but you could definitely bring in other colors. So I have these blue-green colored pencils, and they match each other. I guess you could technically call them the blending group of these particular colored pencils if there were a blending group. They work perfectly together. But there are other colors I could bring in here to add in more color into the highlight areas or into the shadow areas. I could bring in that darkest gray color that I used on one of those kitties, and I could go right up underneath the bottom of that teacup there where the base of it meets the cup itself, and I could definitely darken that up a whole lot more. You could put in tons of detail with colored pencil. Again, I'm not going to do that here. I just kept it pretty simple, but that is always something to keep in mind. All right, so I'm just going to make sure that I have the little shadows underneath these kitties' paws because I definitely want them to look like they're hanging over that the side of that cup, and they would have a cast shadow. So I made sure to build that up really well. And at this point, I am adding a fairly decent amount of pressure. I want this cup to look like it has some shine to it, but I don't want it to be super stark. So I am going to build up quite a bit of color on this little cup here. Also, I'm going to apologize that I'm off screen sometimes. I really had to decide if I wanted to get this really close for you guys on this video or if I was going to make sure it was all on the screen. And I ended up deciding that I'd rather have it zoomed in really close so you can see what I'm doing. Now, I also have this sped up, but in some cases, like the highlight of this teacup, I am doing more of a back and forth motion because when it's laying the pigment there on the front of my card, I want that to look like it's shiny, so it's going side to side, where along the sides there in the darker areas, I just use that scrubbing motion, and that creates a little bit of a different look, a little bit of a different texture. So that's kind of something else that I'm doing. It might be a little bit hard to see. Here's actually a really good example of which direction I'm moving my pencil. So this is going to be white when it's done, but I need to add these shadows so it looks like the cup bends towards the sides, and I'm just going back and forth. I still have a light hand at this point, and I have a light hand for two reasons actually on this one. Number one, because I do want this to be white when it's finished. I don't need a heavy hand here. And number two, because I need it to look like it's going in the direction of the cup itself. So left to right. Hopefully that makes sense. I am going to go back in. I am going to deepen that up just a little bit there on the sides. And I am making sure that I'm giving myself a little bit of space there along the edges so I can get that reflective light there. That'll also help make it look like it's a little bit brighter when everything is finished off. So I'm just going to finish up the center of this, and then I'm actually going to start working on those little hearts here. Now at this point, you could stop using your colored pencils and you could color those little hearts in with just about anything. You could color them in with a red Copic. You could use a gel pen. You could use a red fine tip marker. You could use all sorts of things, but I decided that I wanted to color these in with my colored pencils. And I also wanted to talk about sharpening your pencils. When I first started using colored pencils, it was really hard for me to wrap my brain around the idea of keeping them sharpened. Honestly, I think I had it in my head that I didn't want to sharpen them because I didn't want to waste them. I felt like by sharpening them, I would be wasting them. When in actuality, what I was doing by sharpening them was using them. But I wasn't using them effectively because I didn't have a sharp enough point on them. And that is really part of the key to getting a really good colored image, or coloring in your image really well, is having that really fine point. The finer point you have, the better you can get into those nooks and crannies, and surprisingly enough, the more control you have over your coloring in general, whether it's getting into those smaller areas or whether it's just coloring in the surface itself, you actually have more control with making sure that you have a sharp point on there. So do make sure that you keep a really good sharpener on hand. I use the Prismacolor sharpener that came with my Prismacolor pencils, which is the one I'm using here today, and I like it. But you use whatever works best for you. As long as you get a nice point on there, you should be good to go. Now I am going to show you a little bit of Copic coloring on Kraft cardstock, and I'm going to add a drop shadow to these guys because I felt like they needed a little bit something more, especially since these are just the primary focal point on my card here. So I'm adding the drop shadow just like I do with any drop shadow in any of my cards, mapped it out with a C3, went in with a little bit of C5, blended it out with a C3. Now I have a C1. Then I'm going to go to the C00, and actually I'm also going to be using a colorless blender. At this point, you're going to look at this and you're going to think that I am out of my mind because it looks so dark and so crazy. It's totally fine. This is going to dry back and you're not even going to notice those wet marks. That's all it is right now. It's just wet. That's not color. So if you do this and it looks crazy, like right there, and I actually did that on purpose so you could see it, that's going to look crazy and you're going to go, oh, I just ruined this whole thing. Don't worry about it. Let it dry. You're good to go. So this is actually dried after a few minutes and it's getting better, and I'm just going to continue to let it dry. It'll be just fine. I am going to take a dark green colored pencil here and I'm going to map out my ground. This is my darkest color. And again, I'm doing the same thing here that I did on the rest of those images. I just have a really light hand. I'm using those light scrubbing motions and I'm kind of following the shape of my teacup here. I'm trying not to bring it out too far, but I am following the shape of my teacup. This isn't an exact shadow underneath it. That's fine. It doesn't have to be. It's just kind of a loose, a deeper, darker color underneath there, so we get a little bit of variation and it looks like we have some depth going on underneath that teacup. Then I went in with a mid-colored green, and now I have my lightest green. This is kind of more of a mint, but I really liked how it blended with those other two, and I actually kind of like how it looked with this Kraft cardstock. Now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to build up that color just like I did. This time I'm using more of a back and forth motion. This is actually the same exact way that I would use my hand if I were using a Copic marker. In some ways, using your colored pencils and using your Copics, the same motion that you would use for one, you can actually use for for another, and it works out just fine. And especially since I'm building up that color now, I already had that base underneath it. It was nice and tight. It was nice and packed in there. Now I can kind of just do a little bit of what I want to do to get the finished look here. So I'm going in a back and forth motion. I am taking that lightest one up over the top of the others, but I'm not completely covering it. I'm just kind of going in a few areas there, kind of using a flicking motion. I have my pencil pretty much on its side, and I'm using the side of that pencil. So that is it for the coloring. Now I have my card panel back in my Misty, and I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink because I need it to get my lines back there. That is the one thing about colored pencils, is it will go over the top of those lines and kind of mute them a little bit. So I wanted to make sure that those were crisp and black again, especially those little eye peepers on those kitties. I wanted those guys to stand out. I am taking some Memento London Fog ink, and I'm using the Scenery Seeing Hearts stamp set, and I just stamped those, and I'm going to go over the top of those with my colored pencils. These are the same colors that I used on the hearts on the teacup. Honestly, if I were to do these again, I would probably use a pink gel pen or something to do that, because these were so tiny. It was kind of ridiculous to color them in, but I like the way they turned out, so I guess it's fine. So I'm just going to finish these up, and I didn't leave myself any space for a sentiment on this card, which is a crying shame, because I think it would have really finished it off, but that's fine. We're just going to go with it and call it good. So I have a couple of Copic glitter pins here, and I'm just kind of going over those hearts a little bit, add a little bit more glitter, a little bit more shine, because no card of mine is complete without some glitter on it. So I'm going to fill those in. I'm also going to take a clear Sakura jelly roll pen, and I'm going to go over the top of those hearts again to give them a little bit more dimension. I also go over the little eyes on those kitty cats, and then I also take a white gel pen and just very carefully re-add the highlights on those little itty bitty noses so they pop out a little bit, and then that's it. I'm going to call it good as far as embellishments are concerned. You could definitely add more embellishments if you'd like, but I really just wanted to keep this very clean and very simple and keep the focus on that coloring and those darling little kitties in that teacup from the Purrfect stamp set. All right, folks, we are done. We are good to go. I will be back next week with take 3, and also be sure to follow along to take 4 because I will have a giveaway. It's going to be a $30 gift card to Winnie and Walter, and all you're going to need to do is leave a comment over on my blog telling me which one of these 4 was your favorite and why. In the meantime, I have more details and links on this card down in the description below, as well as over at Winnie and Walter and my blog, The Pink Envelope. I hope you enjoyed my card today. If you did, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Also, be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and tap that bell next to the subscribe button so you can receive all future notifications. Thanks again so much for stopping by. Until next time.